Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to the glory of God and his kingdom. Well, we have a very special treat in store for you because we're going to kick off this program with one of the smartest guys I have ever met, a free range thinker and a man who applies those talents to, well, journalism, yes, but public commentary and speaking and analysis of the absolute, um, well, I think preeminent kind, and certainly of the most needed kind at a time such as this. His name is Alex Newman. We have had him on before, but not for altogether too long. We have been collaborating in a number of other areas, though, in the meantime, including on his own program, the Sentinel Report, as well as the various activities of our Committee on the Present Danger China, and also our Sovereignty Coalition, to which he has contributed mightily, because among the many things that he has really honed in on in the course of his distinguished career is the problem that we face from globalism, as it has come to be called. We're going to talk a little bit about what exactly that entails and what they are trying to do to all of us. And let me just start by saying, Alex, it is an honor to have you with us. I've enjoyed so much our various interactions in these other spaces, and it's terrific to have you back here at Securing America to talk a little bit further in detail about some of this.
It's a
Welcome
great
back.
honor to be here. Thank you so much, Frank.
Thank you. So let's define the term as best we can. To some extent, globalism is, I think, best known by its perpetrators. So let's talk a little bit about who is behind this movement to, well, they call it global governance and the rule that it would impose on all the rest of us.
Well, thanks again for having me, Frank. And globalism is really multifaceted. I think at its core, the essence of globalism is just undermining the sovereignty of nations, undermining self governance, and moving toward a one world system. And there are globalists of different varieties. There are globalists who would like to see a global caliphate, a global Islamic state. There are globalists who would like to see a global communist state. And then there are, of course, some, and I've interacted with some globalists who would like to see kind of a libertarian global government where everybody's rights would be protected. There are, of course, Christians who look forward to the return of Christ, who rule and reign over a one world system. And I think that really is the essence of globalism, is just abolish the distinctions between nations, between tribes, between peoples, and move us all into a one world system. And in recent times, we've seen, I think, a growing collaboration between globalists of different varieties on this project. You have globalist communists, globalist socialists, and global Islamists self evidently, right? They're not even hiding it anymore, openly working together to move us in that general direction. And of course, here in the United States, you have very, very powerful interests. Some of them, business interests. I think this will be good for business. Get rid of borders. We don't have to worry about a lot of different regulations and tax systems. Others think just for ideological reasons that we'd be better off without national distinctions. A lot of them have convinced themselves that this is the best way to avoid war. If we get rid of nation states, then nation states can no longer fight each other. But I think the great danger, even just from a pragmatic perspective, is that once you have all power in one institution around the world, it becomes effectively impossible to resist, to check. And so no matter where you are on that philosophical line, right, from libertarian to totalitarian, if you have a single global entity that rules over the entire planet, it will attract the worst kind of people. It will inevitably become totalitarian. And of course, we see now very clearly the main people pushing for this are themselves totalitarians.
Indeed, they are. Just to be clear, I don't think you specifically referred to one group that is all about globalism, unless I missed it in your characterization of, I don't know, libertarians or socialists in the mix. But the Davos crowd, the World Economic Forum, the global resetters of Klaus Schwab fame, are very much, of course, in the mix in all of this. How would you characterize them? And is their agenda really any different in terms of that end state of sort of comprehensive global governance under, of course, their rule?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Frank. And I did mention the global business leaders, so called, who are on board with this agenda. And that's really what I was thinking about when I'm thinking about the Davos crowd. But when you look at the founder and the leader of this entity, Klaus Schwab, he's been frankly pretty transparent about his view of the way the system should work. He calls it stakeholder capitalism, where instead of having companies that are owned by people serving the interests of shareholders by satisfying the needs and the wants of customers, which is the essence of a free market system. You have to produce what people want better or cheaper or with more diverse options than your competitors. And this results, of course, in a massive production of wealth. So Klaus Schwab has publicly articulated a radical restructuring of that system to what he calls stakeholder capitalism, where all the different stakeholders would have a stake and a say in the operation of that company. And it sounds very sophisticated and very complicated, and I think it's meant to intimidate normal people. But when you actually boil it down to its essence, it is really just fascism. You're talking about, when he lists the stakeholders, the first one he mentions repeatedly is governments. So companies then should serve the interests of governments. And actually, that's exactly what Benito Mussolini outlined when he described fascism as the merger of state and corporate power. Sometimes they call it a public-private partnership. And so the World Economic Forum played an instrumental role in bringing communist China to the state it's at now. Obviously, Marxism, communism, they just destroy massive amounts of wealth. And so the communists in Beijing, working with the communists in Davos, the Marxists, the fascists in Davos, figured out, hey, we've got to change this a little bit. We've got to reintroduce some market mechanisms like pricing, like resource allocation based on certain market forces. But it wasn't because they wanted more productivity or whatever. It was because they wanted to make this totalitarian system more able to, first of all, sustain itself and then able to infect the rest of the world. So you see Klaus Schwab openly cooperating with the mass murdering regime in Beijing. And at first, that doesn't make sense to people. You see Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum signing a strategic partnership with the United Nations for the implementation of UN 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, which is basically just global communism, global tyranny, global fascism. And at first, that doesn't make sense. You see Klaus Schwab with a bust of Vladimir Lenin in his office. And at first, that doesn't make sense. But I think we have to get past the artificial divisions that have been created in our minds between the different types of totalitarians and recognize they are all united on the broader vision, which is the subjection of the individual and the nation to this broader master plan that they have that they think is superior to the decisions we could make as individuals or that we could make as nations. So Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum are an absolutely integral part of the globalist movement, and I'm glad we're having an opportunity to talk about them.
Yeah, well, and, not least, most people, I think, are unaware of it. I wasn't, frankly, until fairly recently, that the Davos meeting is actually not just a once-a-year deal, it's a twice-a-year deal. It's just that the second meeting is in China.
Right, the summer Davos.
So it's kind of a tip, as a clue. One other thing I'd just add, and that was a brilliant exposition, as always, Alex Newman, but there was one other facet of this sort of improved model for communism, and that was if you could get the capitalists to pay for your system, that would prop it up considerably. And we certainly have done that with respect to the Chinese Communist Party. Big
and the
time.
Soviet Union as well. I mean, whether you're
we tried. We just couldn't do it enough, as it turned out. And Ronald Reagan stopped it, I think, is the other piece of that. And nobody has stopped the life support that we've been providing to the Chinese Communist Party. Which brings us to some of the specific projects that these guys have been engaged in, Alex. And I'm not going to take you down the garden path of the larger unrestricted warfare of the Chinese Communist Party against this country specifically for the purposes of taking it out. But I am going to, on the other side of a very short break, ask you to talk a bit about what global governance looks like in the hands of people like the Chinese Communist Party's proxies at the World Health Organization and where the enterprise stands at the moment. I'm anxious to get your take on it. We'll be right back with more with Alex Newman of Liberty Sentinel right after this. We're back, and Alex Newman, I'm pleased to say, is still with us virtually. We are delighted delighted to have him able to, as he does so incredibly brilliantly, synthesize different aspects of this phenomenon that I believe really constitutes the greatest existential threat to freedom in our history, um, far surpassing what the Soviet Union represented back when my old boss Ronald Reagan said it was the greatest existential threat to freedom of that time. But Alex, I want to talk with you about how this threat, this multifaceted, multidimensional, and increasingly aggressive threat from the so-called globalists is now manifesting itself in something called, well, not one but two treaties being conjured up by the World Health Organization. One approved in a much watered down form last month, the end of last month, beginning of this month, actually, June 1, in Geneva. The other temporarily sidelined, but I have the feeling it is not for long, so-called pandemic accord. Um, Talk us through what they're doing with these things and why we should be so determinedly stopping it.
Well, this is one of the most important issues we're facing today, Frank. So, really grateful for the opportunity to speak on it. What they're doing with the World Health Organization is one of the most breathtaking global power grabs we have seen in all of recorded human history. They are, at this point, transparently seeking the power to turn the WHO into not just like a global ministry of health or a global Department of Health and Human Services, complete with an FDA, a CDC, HHS, all the different various divisions. But when you look at how they define healthcare, when you look at how they define health emergencies, whether we're looking at the One Health, where the health of humans is intimately intertwined with the climate and the grass and the animals and the ocean and all the rest of it, or when you, right, precisely, is One Health, it is this integrated holistic view of health as something that encompasses every area of everything, right? And then the other side of this, which is that everything essentially is a public health emergency, as they've said publicly. I was in Egypt and on the Arabian Peninsula at the last two climate summits, where the head of the World Health Organization, the CCP operative, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, former Politburo member of a mass murdering ethno-Marxist terrorist organization called the Tigray People's Liberation Front, when he openly said that climate change is a public health emergency. They've also said that racism is a public health emergency and gun violence is a public health emergency. So if all of those things are public health emergencies, and they have told us that they are, every area of your life would then fall under the purview of this entity if it was able to usurp this power that it is seeking. They did take one big leap forward, no pun intended, with the adoption of some of the amendments to the international health regulations. And Tedros has actually made perfectly clear that they intend to slam through this international pandemic treaty, accord, agreement. They've got different names, I think, for technical legal reasons. They know they're not going to get it through the U.S. Senate, but it is a treaty. And they promise they're going to do that either by the end of this year or at the very latest May of 2025. So they have not given up. They will not give up unless and until humanity says no.
And just to be clear, you're talking about the pandemic treaty,
Yes.
not the agreement that they have now adopted, which I believe, as I think you do, is also a treaty, the
Yes.
amendments to various international health regulations. And Alex, one of the things that our colleague Mike Farris tumbled upon, which I think is particularly important for us to understand about this thing, which again, as you say, the president has no intention of submitting to the Senate, but will have to, I think, before it's over, is that it actually has a requirement baked into it. A lot of the problematic stuff was left on the cutting room floor. I call it kind of like the balloonist trying to clear a mountain. They kept throwing ballast off to get it over. But one thing that stuck, one thing that is in it, is a requirement that we create an international health regulation czar, if you will, to assure that we are complying with whatever else they cook up. And it specifically says you must change your laws to arrange this. And what Mike Farris has pointed out is that, as you may know, back when this whole enterprise was first introduced, this World Health Organization in 47, 48, it was very explicitly stated We're not changing our laws pursuant to this stuff. It's all advisory, and that would be up to us to decide whether we took the advice or not. We saw how it worked in pandemic COVID-19, where a lot of the things that this Communist Party of China operative, as you call him, Tedros, advised us to do was nonetheless taken as holy writ. And we wound up, I think, needlessly losing about 1 million Americans because we followed his terrible prescriptions. But I want to ask you, in addition to all of that, about the next shoe to drop, Alex. And you've got, as usual, your eye over the horizon at what's coming up in September, I believe the 23rd of September, namely a summit of the future at the UN General Assembly. What's up with that? And is it likely to be yet another of these globalist power grabs?
Yeah, and we just talked about the WHO power grab, which I described as one of the most breathtaking attempts to usurp power ever in recorded human history. Well, what they're planning for the Summit of the Future is even beyond that. It deals with areas that, like prior to COVID, we didn't even realize these were freedoms we had to defend. That's the situation with these power grabs at the Summit of the Future. The Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, who also a socialist, in fact, before taking over the UN, he was the head of the Socialist Internationale, which actually traces its lineage directly back to Karl Marx. For some perspective, they've got political parties as members that have the blood of countless innocent people on their hands. These are not nice people. And he has put out these policy briefs across a whole range of issues, including, incidentally, emergencies. That's the first one that I came across. I broke that story in April of last year in the Epic Times. I encourage people to read this policy brief. It's not that long, and it is almost unbelievable. If it wasn't on the UN website, you almost would have to wonder whether you were dreaming or this was some sort of, funny attempt to make the UN look bad. Because what is stated in this thing very explicitly is that in the event that the Secretary General of the UN declares a global emergency, which, by the way, doesn't have to be global and doesn't have to be an emergency, all power and authority would be exercised by the UN. Nation states, businesses, civil society, we would all go to the UN and its specialized agencies for our marching orders. And this comes through crystal clear. They give a number of examples of what could be a global emergency. It could be environment, it could be war, it could be economic, it could be a black swan event, it could be something we don't know. Right, aliens, right? They got now the UN is focusing on alleged aliens from outer space. Who knows what all that means? But it could be basically anything. Right. And we know the tendency of totalitarians. When you give them a loophole through which to usurp power, they will inevitably do it. So this is a recipe for disaster. It talks about global censorship. It is enormously dangerous. And one more thing, Frank, if I may, on the office of the IHR coordinator for every country. One thing that people I don't think are picking up on yet about the danger of the WHO, even if you agree, if you're in alignment with what the WHO is asking for here, they're trying to resurrect the same process that they use on the climate change front. They want to add in a COP process, a conference of the parties, where every year they'll get together and they'll usurp new powers. And then those will be implemented at the national level by this national coordinator for IHR. So this is really a blank check to tyrants over the lives, wealth, and security of every person on the planet.
Yeah. Boy, is that well put. And quite literally, we're talking about wealth transfers as well. This is one of the things that's very problematic about this World Health Organization exercise is it's pretty explicitly a blank check. And if the Senate of the United States doesn't get on top of this and block it, I think, Alex, you're absolutely right. We're going to see the tyrants moving through that loophole. A lot of that ballast that they had to jettison will be back in the mix. They'll get that pandemic treaty, and yes, they will get the plan for the future out of this summit as well. This is why I believe that we need this election season to make a defining voting issue stopping the globalists. I hope that President Trump, who seems set on doing that, is up to the job, and we need to be supportive of every effort in that regard. Alex, we have to leave it at that. God bless you and the work you do at Liberty Central Media. I hope you will come back to us again very soon, and look forward to the occasion to chat and collaborate as ever. God bless you. Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back.